Picture this. You've been thinking about your grandchildren all week. Maybe you baked their favorite cookies. Maybe you just missed their little faces. So you drive over. Could be 10 minutes away, could be 45. You pull up to the driveway, walk up to the front door, and you knock. The door opens, and your daughter-in-law looks you in the eye and says, "You should have called first. You're not welcome here without an invitation." The door closes. You're standing there on that porch, maybe with cookies in your hands, and the world just got very, very quiet. What do? Do you knock again and demand to speak to your son? Do you get back in your car and cry the whole way home? Do you pick up your phone right then and call your son, or your sister, or your best friend, and tell them what just happened? I want you to stop, just for a moment, before you do any of those things. Because after more than 40 years as a psychologist, 40 years of sitting across from mothers, fathers, grandmothers, and grandfathers who were in your exact shoes, I can tell you this with complete confidence. How you respond in the next 48 hours will define your relationship with your grandchildren for years to come. Not next week. Not next month. The next 48 hours. So before you pick up that phone, before you say a single word to your son, before you do anything at all, I need you to watch this video first. I'm going to walk you through 6 specific things that I would tell any parent sitting across from me in my office right now. 6 things that can help you navigate this moment with wisdom, with dignity, and with the best possible chance of staying close to the grandchildren you love. Let's begin. Before we get to the 6 things, I need to talk with you about something important. Because if you don't understand what just happened at that front door, really understand it, you are going to make decisions based on the wrong information. Here's the first thing I need you to know. What she said was not necessarily about hate. I know that feels impossible right now. I know it felt like rejection. It may have felt like she was drawing a line in the sand, choosing her turf over your relationship. But in my 4 decades of working with families, I have learned that when a daughter-in-law says, "You need an invitation before you come over," she is almost never saying, "I hate you." What she is almost always saying is something closer to, "I need to feel like I'm in control of my own home." There's a big difference between a boundary and a rejection. A rejection says, "You are not wanted." A boundary says, "I need things to work a certain way in order for this relationship to be sustainable." Now, is the way she delivered that message ideal? Probably not. Was it painful? Absolutely. But understanding the difference between those 2 things, between a rejection and a boundary, that is what is going to allow you to respond wisely instead of reactively. Here's the second thing I need you to know. Your first instinct is probably wrong. When we are in pain, our nervous system goes into emergency mode. And in that emergency mode, most of us have one of 3 automatic responses, and all 3 of them, in this situation, will make things worse. The first instinct is, "I'm calling my son right now." You want him to fix this. You want him to tell her she was out of line. And I completely understand that impulse. But when you call your son in that moment, while you're still hurt, while you're still shaking, you are almost certainly going to say something that puts him in an impossible position. And that conversation rarely goes the way we hope. The second instinct is the silent one. Fine, I'm never going back. You pull away. You stop calling. You make yourself invisible. And you tell yourself it's because you have dignity. But psychologists have a word for this pattern. We call it the martyr response. And here's the painful truth about it. The person who gets hurt most when you disappear from that family is not your daughter-in-law. It's your grandchildren. The third instinct, and this one is very common, is to frame it as a control issue. She's trying to isolate my son from me. She's controlling him. And maybe, there is something to explore there. But when we're hurt, we tend to reach for the most dramatic explanation first. And that framing, applied too quickly, closes off your ability to see anything else. So before we get to what you should do, I needed to name what you shouldn't do first. Now, let's talk about those 6 things. Give yourself 24 to 48 hours before you do anything. I know this is not what you want to hear. When we are hurt, we want to do something. We want to respond, to defend ourselves, to set the record straight. That impulse is completely human. But here is what is happening inside your brain in that moment, and I say this as someone who has spent a career studying how people make decisions under stress. When you experience sudden emotional pain, especially pain tied to rejection or humiliation, a part of your brain called the amygdala fires off like an alarm system. And when that alarm is going, the part of your brain responsible for wise decision-making, your prefrontal cortex, gets flooded. It essentially goes offline. In plain terms, when you are in that much pain, your brain is physically not able to think clearly. The decisions you make in that window are almost always ones you will regret. This is why the very first thing I tell every parent who comes to me in this situation is, do not do anything for at least 24 to 48 hours. Not a phone call. Not a text. Not a conversation with your son. Nothing. Give your nervous system time to come down from that acute stress response. Give your prefrontal cortex time to come back online. Now, what do you do in those 48 hours? First, write it all down. Get a journal or even just a piece of paper and write out everything you are feeling. The hurt, the anger, the confusion, the grief, all of it. This is not a letter you are going to send to anyone. This is just for you. Getting those feelings out of your body and onto paper is one of the most effective tools we have in psychology for emotional regulation. Second, call one person, the right person. Not your other children. Not your sister who has always disliked your daughter-in-law. Call a close friend who is wise and calm. Or call a therapist if you have one. Someone who will listen without immediately taking sides or adding fuel to the fire. You need to be heard right now, but you need to be heard by someone who will help you think clearly, not someone who will make you angrier. Third, take care of your body. Go for a walk. Pray if that brings you peace. Do something with your hands, garden, cook, organize. Your body needs to discharge some of that stress energy before your mind can function well again. I want to say something here that I mean with great respect for you. The most powerful thing a mother or father can do after being hurt like this is to not react immediately. Silence in this moment is not weakness. Pausing is not surrender. It is strategy. It is the single most effective thing you can do to protect your relationship with your son and with those grandchildren. In the long run, give yourself the gift of those 48 hours. This is the hardest step, and the most important one. If you only do one thing differently after watching this video, I want it to be this one. Because in all my years of practice, this is the step that most parents skip. And it's the one that keeps families stuck. I want you to ask yourself, honestly, privately, in the quiet of your own heart, some difficult questions. These are the same questions I would gently walk you through if you were sitting across from me in my office. Have you shown up at their home without calling first? More than once? Have there been moments, maybe small ones, maybe you didn't even realize it at the time, where you made a comment about how she keeps the house, how she parents the children, what she feeds them, what she does or doesn't do for your son? Does your son ever seem like he's caught in the middle, like he has to navigate carefully between the two of you? Now, I want to be very clear about something. Asking these questions does not mean you deserve to be spoken to the way you were spoken to. You did not deserve that. A person can have a legitimate complaint and still express it in a way that is hurtful and inappropriate. But asking these questions is essential, because it gives you the full picture. And the full picture is the only thing that will allow you to find your way forward. In my work, I use something I call the contribution question. It's simple. What, if anything, have I contributed to this dynamic? Not, is everything my fault? Not, am I a terrible person? Just, is there anything I may have done, even without meaning to, that made her feel like her home wasn't quite her own? That made her feel judged? That made your son feel pulled in two directions? Here is the truth that most of us don't learn until later in life. We can love someone deeply and still make them feel unseen. We can mean well and still cause pain. Those two things can both be true at the same time. If you look honestly in that mirror and see something, even something small, that's not a reason to feel shame. It's a reason to feel hope. Because if you contributed to this, that means you have the power to change it. And if you look honestly in that mirror and truly cannot see anything you would do differently, then you'll carry that truth into your next conversation with a clean conscience, and that matters too. Either way, do not skip this step. Not to complain, not to make him choose, but to reconnect. At some point, after those 48 hours have passed, after you have done some journaling, after you've had that conversation with a trusted friend, you are going to need to talk to your son. And I want to prepare you for that conversation, because this is the one that people most often get wrong. The wrong way to begin that conversation sounds like this. Did you hear what your wife said to me? You need to talk to her. That was completely unacceptable, and I am not going to be treated that way. I understand exactly why that feels like the right thing to say. You were hurt. You deserve an apology. You want your son to acknowledge that. But here is what happens when you open with that. You immediately put him in an impossible position. He loves you. He also loves her. He chose her. And when you call him and ask him to stand against her on your behalf, you are asking him to do something that is genuinely painful for him, and something that, in most cases, will not end the way you are hoping. He is likely to get defensive. He may minimize what happened. He may say things like, "Mom, you know how she is." Or worse, he may turn it around and tell you things you weren't prepared to hear. And then you've had a conversation that made everything worse, not better. So here is how I want you to approach this instead. I call it the 3-step reconnection. And every word of it matters. Step 1. Open with love, not complaint. Start the conversation by reminding him of what is true and unchanging between you. Something like, "I love you. I'm not calling to cause trouble or to put you in the middle of anything. I just needed to hear your voice. This is not manipulation. This is the truth." And it sets a tone that makes him more likely to stay open to what comes next. Step 2. Express your feeling without attacking her. This is the key distinction. There is a difference between saying, "Your wife is cruel and she disrespected me," which is an attack, and saying, "When I came by and was told I need an invitation before I can see my grandchildren, I felt really hurt and confused. I didn't know things had gotten to that point." The first statement is about her. The second statement is about you. And when you speak about your own feelings, without attributing motives, without calling names, without demanding a verdict, he can actually hear you. Step 3. Ask for his perspective. This is the part most parents forget. After you've shared how you feel, say this. "Can you help me understand how things feel from your side? I want to understand, not just be understood." Then do the hardest thing. Listen. Really listen. Do not interrupt. Do not defend yourself. Do not start composing your counter-argument in your head while he is still talking. You may hear something that surprises you. You may hear something that hurts. You may hear something that finally explains a dynamic that has confused you for years. All of that is valuable. And here is an important note. If your son becomes very defensive or dismissive or immediately begins to place all the blame on you, that is information too. That may be a sign that the situation is more complicated than a simple boundary dispute. We'll talk about what to do in that case when we get to thing 6. But for now, have this one conversation. Keep it calm. Keep it brief. And let him know that you love him, no matter what. Most parents skip this. That is a mistake. This one surprises people. And I understand why. After what happened, the last person you want to contact is her. It feels backwards. It feels like rewarding bad behavior. It may even feel like humiliating yourself. But here is what I have observed over 40 years of family work. One of the most consistent things that daughters-in-law report feeling in difficult mother-in-law relationships is this: she never talks to me directly. She always goes through my husband. When communication flows through your son as the go-between, it creates a dynamic where she always feels like she is on the outside of something. Like decisions about her family are being made in conversations she is not part of. And that feeling, over time, builds walls. Reaching out to her directly, not to confront, not to litigate what happened, but simply to open a door, is one of the most disarming things you can do. Now, the how matters enormously here. Do not call her. A phone call requires an immediate response and puts her on the spot. That is too much pressure for someone who is already guarded. Instead, I recommend either a short handwritten note or a brief, carefully worded text message. Handwritten is better if you have the time. There is something about handwriting that signals sincerity in a way that a text cannot. But either will work. And here is what I want you to say, or something very close to it. You can adapt the words to sound like yourself, but keep the spirit exactly as I describe it. I've been thinking about the other day, and I don't want there to be distance between us. I know I may not always get things right, no one does, and if I have done something that made you feel like your home isn't fully your own, I genuinely want to understand that. I love and those grandchildren more than anything in this world. I hope we can talk when you feel ready. That's it. Short. Sincere. No defensiveness. No guilt-tripping. No, but I was only trying to. No, after everything I've done for this family. None of that. What you are doing with this message is signaling 3 things. 1. You see her. You are not going through her husband. You are speaking to her as a person. 2. You are willing to take some ownership, even without knowing exactly what you did wrong. That takes courage, and she will feel it. 3. You are leaving the door open for her to respond in her own time, without pressure. After you send that message, do not follow up for at least 1 week. I know the urge to check in will be strong. Resist it. Give her space. If she responds, wonderful. Follow her lead. If she doesn't respond right away, that is not a rejection. That is someone who is still processing. Let her process. You have planted a seed. Now let it grow at its own pace. This is where most grandparents lose the long game. I want to say something here that may be hard to hear, but I am saying it because I respect you and because I have seen too many grandparents damage their relationships with their grandchildren by refusing to accept this one truth. It is her home. In the eyes of the law, in the eyes of psychology, and in the practical reality of everyday life, that house belongs to your son and your daughter-in-law. And within the walls of that home, she has the right to set the terms of who comes in and when. That does not mean her terms are always reasonable. That does not mean you can never express that something feels unfair. But it does mean that fighting against that basic reality, openly, repeatedly, or passive-aggressively, will cost you far more than it will ever gain you. So what does respecting the boundary actually look like in practice? It means calling or texting before you come over. Every single time. Not most of the time. Every time. Even if it feels unnecessary. Even if you used to just drop by. That chapter is closed for now, and the only way to reopen it is to show consistently that you understand and respect the current terms. It means not saying, to your son, to your grandchildren, to anyone in that family circle, "This is ridiculous." Even if you believe that privately. Even if your friends agree with you completely. Because anything you say to anyone in that orbit has a very high probability of getting back to her. And every time it does, you lose ground. It means not recruiting your grandchildren as allies. This is one I feel very strongly about. If you are ever tempted to say something to your grandchildren, even something small, something that feels harmless, about how unfair things are, or how much you wish you could see them more often, please don't. Children are not equipped to carry that weight, and involving them in adult conflict causes harm that can last for years. Now, I want to reframe something, because I think many of you are hearing "respect the boundary" and translating it as "give up" or "let her win." It is not giving up. It is the opposite. The grandparent who pushes the hardest, who shows up unannounced, who argues about the rules, who makes every visit feel like a negotiation, is almost always the grandparent who ends up seeing their grandchildren the least. The grandparent who steps back graciously, who follows the agreed-upon terms without complaint, who shows up as safe and predictable and warm. That grandparent earns trust. And trust is the currency that eventually opens more doors. Play the long game. Your grandchildren are worth it. Sometimes love isn't enough. You need a professional in the room. The 5 things we've discussed so far. Pausing before you act, looking honestly in the mirror, talking to your son with care, reaching out to her directly, respecting the boundary. These are powerful tools. And for many families, working through those 5 things will begin to shift things in the right direction. But I would be doing you a disservice if I didn't address what happens when the situation is more serious than a simple boundary dispute. Because sometimes, not always, but sometimes, what looks like a daughter-in-law with firm boundaries is actually something more complicated. And I want you to know the signs. Sign 1. Your son has completely cut off contact with you. Not just reduced contact, but eliminated it, and cannot give you a coherent reason why. That is not a boundary. That is estrangement. And estrangement rarely happens in a healthy relationship without a complex web of causes that deserve careful attention. Sign 2. You are being denied access to your grandchildren with no specific reason given. This is particularly serious if you have been an active caretaker or an important presence in their lives. In some states, grandparents have legal rights in these situations, and it is worth knowing what those rights are in your state. Sign 3. You have noticed significant personality changes in your son. He seems anxious, disconnected from his old friends and family, reluctant to speak freely when she is nearby. These can be signs of a relationship dynamic that goes beyond typical in-law tension, and they deserve professional attention, not from you directly, but from a trained therapist. Sign 4. Any kind of contact between you and the grandchildren is being used as leverage, withheld when there is conflict, restored only when you comply with demands. That pattern is worth discussing with a family therapist or counselor. If any of those signs resonate with your situation, here is what I recommend. First, consider suggesting family therapy, not as an ultimatum, but as an invitation. Something like, "I love all of you too much to let this distance stay between us. Would you be willing to sit down with a family therapist, not to take sides, but just so everyone feels heard?" Some couples will say yes. Some won't. But making the offer positions you as someone who wants resolution, not conflict. Second, consider individual therapy for yourself, not because something is wrong with you, but because you are carrying something heavy, and you deserve a safe place to work through it with someone who is trained to help. This is not a sign of weakness. It is one of the wisest things any person can do in a painful and complicated situation. And third, if you believe your grandchildren's well-being is genuinely at risk, or that your relationship with them is being systematically severed, please look into your rights as a grandparent in your state. Organizations like the American Association of Retired Persons, AARP, and various grandparents' rights groups can help you understand what legal protections may be available to you. Asking for help is not giving up. It is loving your family enough to do whatever it actually takes. Before I let you go, I want to zoom out for just a moment, because I think there is something bigger happening in this experience than just a conflict with your daughter-in-law. This moment, as painful as it is asking something of you. It's asking you, who do you want to be in this chapter of your life? Not who you used to be. Not who you think you should be. Not who everyone else expects you to be. But who you actually choose to be, when things are hard and unfair and you didn't deserve any of this. In 40 years of this work, here is what I have seen again and again. The families that navigate moments like this one and come out closer on the other side are almost always families where the older generation chose wisdom over pride. Not because they were wrong, not because they had to surrender, but because they loved their children and grandchildren more than they loved being right. That is extraordinary. And it is possible for you. Let me leave you with a quick summary of the 6 things we talked about today. 1. Feel the pain, but don't act from it. Give yourself 48 hours before you do anything. 2. Look honestly in the mirror. Ask yourself the hard questions with courage and compassion. 3. Have one private conversation with your son, the right way. Speak your feelings without attacking her. And listen more than you speak. 4. Reach out to your daughter-in-law directly. A short, sincere note. No defensiveness. An open door. 5. Respect the boundary, even if it feels unfair. Because the grandparent who plays the long game wins the long game. 6. Know when to get help. There is no shame in bringing in a professional when the situation is bigger than family dynamics alone. You did not raise your son to lose him. And those grandchildren, they need you in their lives. Maybe not on the schedule you hoped for. Maybe not in the way you imagined. But they need the version of you that keeps showing up with love, even when it's hard. This is hard. I know it is. But you are stronger than this moment. If this video helped you, please give it a like and share it with someone who might be going through the same thing. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Which of these 6 steps feels the hardest for you right now? I read every single comment, and I respond as often as I can. If you're new here, welcome to Strong Elderly Life. We talk about what it really means to live with strength, wisdom, and dignity after 60. I'd love for you to subscribe and be part of this community. Take good care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.